This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. So we're really excited to be speaking with Ben Breen today, who is Associate Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz. In 2024, Ben published Tripping on Utopia, Margaret Mead, the Cold War, and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science with Grand Central. His first book, The Age of Intoxication, Origins of the Global Drug Trade, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press and won the 2021 William H. Welch Medal from the American Society for the History of Medicine. Congratulations, Ben, on this recent book and all the wonderful attention it has received.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
So I feel like I have to ask, because of the Michael Pollan book about psychedelics, did you try psychedelics to better understand them when you were working on this book?
Yeah, I've had a couple of people ask me that. I did actually, and I had used them before. I did also write this book while I became a father for the first time while writing the book, so it wasn't really a good time to be experimenting much. So it was very early in the process of researching it that I thought I would try once. It had been several years since I tried psychedelics, and then since then, being a new parent, it hasn't really been on my to-do list.
And did your experience resonate with things you were reading about in your research?
It actually did, yeah. One of the things that was, I think, of most interest to scientists who used psychedelics in the 50s and 60s was the ways it gets you to think about subjectivity, personhood, and like your connection to the larger world, and breaking down the barriers between the individual and society was of interest in 20th century social science and also early neuroscience. And it's true that, like, not to get into it too much, but when I did take psychedelics as sort of a trial run when I was beginning researching this book, I had a moment where I was sitting in a beautiful meadow and I saw a little rabbit eating a patch of grass, and I couldn't tell if it was me looking at the rabbit or the rabbit looking at me. That was my actual sense of self. So that was kind of useful to remind myself that it actually can be quite a kind of transformative experience. It can feel transforming. At the same time, I also wanted to have distance on the topic. So I'm kind of glad I didn't do it more than once in the past few years, because I think it was important to not approach the topic as someone with a strong personal opinion about it. I wanted to be really open-minded when I returned to this material, and over a period of several years kind of worked through different perspectives on it from different historical figures without too much baggage of my own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As some reviews of this recent book noted, the timing doesn't seem like an accident. Psychedelic therapy is now having a kind of second heyday, and it sounds like one of the many reasons your book maybe received so much positive attention is that it's doing this kind of history of showing us today that what we're experiencing had a history earlier, but that what happened in the 1920s with Margaret Mead is not history many of us know. And as you write in the introduction, Timothy Leary and the baby boomers did not usher in the first psychedelic era, they ended it. So that's a different way of thinking about the popularity of this science than I think many of us realize. Was that discovery of this earlier history of psychedelic science that so many of us didn't know about until reading your book, was that part of the appeal of telling this history?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt like there was an untold group of stories, like a narrative of interrelated historical actors, like people who all knew each other and had interesting lives in the period from the 20s to the 60s that I wanted to key in on it. I will say it's not like I discovered that history. That history has been told many times in academic books. Also in some kind of crossover books, like there's a book by Mike J. called Mescaline, A Global History, which follows the indigenous and pre-Columbian uses of the peyote cactus from thousands of years ago up until through the colonial period in New Spain, through the 19th century and up to the 20th century with the synthesis of mescaline from the peyote cactus. So it's kind of like looking at how a, you know, pre-modern psychedelic history links up to the beginnings of psychedelic science. So that was a big model for me. That book was really, I think, a really great book, and it was useful for seeing how to do it. What I wanted to do was make it more of a narrative around a group of people. And that was new because I think a lot of those stories did kind of fall out of the picture with this sort of wave of press attention around psychedelic therapy and psychedelic science in the late 60s. A lot of the people involved earlier had actually personal reasons for not wanting to talk about it. They were embarrassed, they had moved on in their lives, they had given up on the field, or they just straight up didn't want to be in the news, right? Which is reasonable. And so I feel like with the passage of time, those stories have taken on a new resonance and they became quite interesting to me because number one, I didn't really know about them before. And number two, I felt like they had a lot of bearing and relevance for making decisions and thinking about psychedelic medicine today.
Yeah, I mean, what you say reminds me of what comes out in your book about Margaret Mead and her sexuality, and I guess her fears about that becoming public knowledge in the 40s or 50s when she didn't want it to be. So maybe that's an example of someone being more quiet about her involvement in this.
Yeah, I very much so. Margaret Mead was fascinating because she was both simultaneously one of the most visible and publicly well-known scientists in the world, up there with Oppenheimer and Einstein in her lifetime, but also extremely secretive and private. And I found that to be very compelling as a historian because I could try to untangle what was going on in her life to kind of cause that paradoxical way of being in the world. And I also just found her psychologically interesting because she was so complicated. And I think was ripe for a sort of reassessment in the context of not just psychedelic science, but the science of the mind, the origins of neuroscience. She's actually quite influential in the origins of artificial intelligence research. And so I thought, even though she's quite famous still, it's sort of a misnomer to see her only as a cultural anthropologist. She was actually kind of this polymathic scientist who moved through different fields and had different influences in different ways. And I wanted to kind of pull out her interest in what in the book I called it not just it's not just psychedelic science. It's like this larger field that I call the science of consciousness expansion, or just the science of consciousness. Like this sense that there's an ability of science in the early 20th century to intervene in how humans see themselves. And it's kind of entangled with the origins of modern neuroscience, but it's not quite the same thing. It's more of like a applied science of shaping how people experience the world and their own consciousness. Margaret Mead was really interested, for instance, in trance states and hypnosis in the 20s and 30s. And she also did research on peyote in 1930. And so those are kind of all entangled together in this larger field in the making that doesn't really come together as an academic discipline, you know?
Mhm.
Like neuroscience hadn't yet been coined as a term, or at least was not in wide use. And then same with computer science. Later in the 50s and 60s, those fields kind of cohere around a set of people and a set of ideas. And Margaret Mead kind of gets left out of them. You know, she's sort of like doing her own thing. And I find her to be really fascinating for that reason, that even despite how famous she was sort of written out of some of these stories. And in some cases, as you said, intentionally didn't want to reveal too much about herself. You know, this is a Cold War story as well. She was being very careful about how much she revealed in the context of, you know, it's in the 1950s, like the McCarthy era. Like she had to be very selective about how much of herself she put out there.
Yeah, I really had a new appreciation for her. I mean, what a remarkable life story. I also really enjoyed how you told the story of her relationships. I mean, it felt like she was trying on different identities or figuring out who she was through these men and women that she fell in love with in different parts of her life.
Yeah, I mean, she was someone who I think in my research I saw her at one point saying that she always needed both a husband and a wife in her
Mm.
life.
Hmm.
And she was extremely extroverted, extremely socially adept, and really thrived in what I find to be very complex and entangled personal relationships. She just kind of liked having a complicated personal life. Um, and yeah, she really was sort of someone who had these multiple overlapping relationships that transformed the lives of the people she was with, in ways that were both personal, but also I think like historically relevant.
Hmm.
Ruth Benedict, her first great mentor, and her probably the great love of her life, along with Gregory Bateson. That partnership with Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, which is explored in this book, Gods of the Upper Air by Charles King, which is another big influence for me, was a big deal in the history of anthropology, really kind of in the history of the social sciences, and you could even make an argument in the history of globalization because it was sort of the beginning of this advent of like applied anthropology intervening in the world. In World War II, both Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead were directly involved in um, psychological studies of, figures in the leadership of the Axis powers, like Hitler's Germany, but also in just like thinking through the post-war order, what became the Cold War political order. It was actually strongly shaped by this era of cultural anthropology, and that cultural anthropology was in turn largely a group of people who were very close to Margaret Mead, and in some cases, extremely close indeed, like Ruth Benedict and Gregory Bateson.
For this book, you moved to a trade press, and I'm wondering if this different kind of book, a more popular book, did you feel this would allow you to tell the story in a different way than you might have done if it were another academic press book?
Yeah, I feel like it could have gone either way because I really wanted the book to be very archivally grounded. I did like quite a lot of archival research. A lot of it was during COVID, which meant that I had to kind of switch to doing digital research. But luckily, the archivists I worked with were able to scan in archival documents and send them to me as PDFs. So I'm very, very super grateful to every archivist and librarian who worked with me during that period. It was literally, I truly could not have done it without that help. Um, and so I always saw it as a book that was really grounded in those like primary sources. So in that sense, it's kind of academic. But the story, because it's a narrative about a group of people, that was a chance to kind of do a different type of book in terms of the writing style, which I have always wanted to try. And also, I think the subject matter is of interest to a wider audience than some books I could have written.
Right.
You know, I could have written a social history of 18th century apothecaries, for instance, and I don't know if as much as I find that really interesting personally, it doesn't have the same built-in audience. So I did think about that when I was thinking about where to go with it.
Thinking about your writing specifically, I'm thinking how the beginning of the book, the introduction, opens with a Diego Rivera mural. And I'm just wondering how you thought to, I mean, I love the opening you're describing this art, how how it occurred to you that I can connect this somehow to the psychedelics I'm talking about, the history that I'm telling here. What made you go with that opening?
I just really like visual openings, actually. I actually, before I wanted to be a historian, I wanted to be a visual artist. So I always think of history and the visual arts as connected. It's just sort of the nature of how I became interested in history in the first place was through paintings. So that's sort of just my personal reason for why it made sense to me. But in terms of telling a narrative, I wanted to kind of really, I wanted to do two things. One, ground it in the Great Depression era and World War II era. So push the frame back temporally to kind of situate us in literally a different physical world, different material culture, a different set of circumstances, technologically, socially, like rather than seeing psychedelics always evoke the 60s or 70s, at least in my experience. And I wanted to see what would happen if we jumped us off in a very key, like classic Great Depression setting, like Rockefeller Center, Diego Rivera, 1933. Like that's just changes the frame. But then also, as a metaphor for the book, I loved this idea of this painting, a really beautiful painting that was very vivid and kind of sensational. Like the way it was painted was really over the top and kind of psychedelic looking. If you look up the replica of it, but which was torn off a wall and if not forgotten, but kind of removed from the visible world. It was remembered, but only as a memory, and it no longer exists physically. And, and to me, that was a great metaphor for what happened to psychedelic science in the period I cover in the book. it was this beautiful dream. It was this vivid and very real thing for a while, and then it completely went away, and it got replaced by something that I think was more boring. And not to be down on the current painting in Rockefeller Center, but I've always thought, what a shame, because
Right.
the painting that replaced it was all is a monochrome painting. It's all beige,
Hmm.
and it's not nearly as interesting as the painting that was there before. So to me, that's the metaphor of the book.
Yeah, it really works. Another thing structurally about the book, it's divided into these three parts, and it's 27 chapters. This is seems pretty common with trade press books, as opposed to our academic press books, where you have these long, sprawling chapters. That your chapters are relatively short or normal for trade press, and they're a year or two or just a few years. Was this organization suggested to you by the editor, or how did you come up with it?
My editor was very helpful in thinking about how to segment things. So partially, yes, I think that I initially had like 16 chapters in mind, and he helped me figure out how to break them up. And really, he was Colin Dickerman. Thank you, Colin, for helping me figure out how to make it work in temporal order. Because you're right, like the way historians and other humanistic academics work is usually more like 6 to 8 article length chapters that are like just jumping around in time to make an argument. And that's how my first book was structured. It's probably how my next book might be structured. We'll see. But I, I I really did want to make a narrative out of it and something that would propel you forward in time and get a sense of the changes from one year to the next. And so I initially had a lot more jumps in time. I was trying to make it a narrative, but it would like originally the first chapter started in the 50s, and then it jumped back to Margaret Mead's childhood, and then it moved forward, and then it jumped around a little bit after that. He made me just reorder it to go straight through temporally from the beginning to the end and cut out the childhood biography part, which was probably smart. Um, and so that was kind of like a product of the revision process. But I did from the beginning have this idea of writing, you know, I think I was thinking about 16 to 20 chapters. I was actually influenced by an academic book or a kind of a crossover book, Plutopia by Kate Brown. I don't know if you know this book, but it's wonderful. It's such a good book, and I think it's from Oxford University Press, I want to say, and it's like comparing the two cities that are associated with the atomic programs of the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, jumping back and forth between these two very similar groups of people in similar places, but totally different sides of the Iron Curtain.
Hmm.
And it has like 54
Oh,
chapters.
wow.
So I really loved how she did that. I found it like extremely readable and like structurally interesting to see someone doing that. So that just kind of gave me like the sense of that you're allowed to do that when writing a history book. You don't have to do it any particular way.
Right. No, I've also found the shorter chapters. I've been intrigued how that makes books more readable. Your editor suggesting to cut out the childhood, the going back in time, was that feeling, well, this is not a biography of Mead, so we don't need that, or what do you think his thinking was?
Yeah, I think he was just trying to move it into the part that the title's about. I mean, that's always the issue for historians is you turn up all this interesting material in an archive. Like I had so much on Gregory Bateson's childhood. I had a lot on Margaret Mead's, Gregory Bateson, who's another major figure in the book because he gets involved in psychedelic science as well. He's Margaret Mead's third husband. But I just start us off with them meeting. I don't even really talk about the first husband, which was just, you know, again, if it was a straight ahead biography, I would, but it wasn't germane to the story. And I had to just kind of find what the frame of the narrative was and
Mm-hmm.
also what the frame of historical analysis was and just stick to that. The other thing is I had a lot of scene setting segments and chapters. Like I had a whole thing about the 1939 World's Fair, which I personally find very interesting
Mm-hmm.
because it's like happening during the beginning of World War II. And it's all about utopia and this like, technological yearning for a better world. But like literally as it opens, World War II is beginning. And so it just casts this whole kind of pall over the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it to me really dramatically interesting. But the thing was like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson never went to the World's Fair. They were
Mm-hmm.
just living in New York at the same time as
Mm-hmm.
it. So I couldn't really, I had a whole chapter on it, which was like about the way drugs were talked about. Maybe I'll make an article about it, like the kind of early beginnings of the idea of a wonder drug during that era, but then also how during World War II drugs were mobilized as weapons. So it became
Mm-hmm.
this whole kind of like mini paradox of the
Hmm.
larger world at the time. Um, so I remember cutting a chapter about that as well. A lot of that early material that I surfaced for the book was me figuring out the topic because I'm trained as a early modernist. So my PhD training ended around 1820.
Mm.
And so even though I obviously had some background in the 20th century, I had to like really get into the secondary history, like secondary sources and like basically teach myself a lot of it. And so a lot of the early material I wrote for the book, I just ended up cutting because it was basically just me learning the scene and the topic.
Yeah, I know there's some thought that maybe in a nonfiction book, a trade press one anyway, you would do every other chapter would have that kind of context setting, but I don't know that it's necessary. And it sounds like your editor might have been of the mind you can just move along in the story.
Yeah, he was quite insistent about how like you don't I remember adding in like when I was editing like I'll do a signposting chapter here where we're just saying, oh, it's 1940 now, we move forward a couple years, here's what's going on in the world. And he was really clear about how it doesn't really work to have one chapter jump out as like setting the scene.
Hmm.
It needs to have other functions in a narrative as well as just giving a context. And that was interesting for me because like you can have pages of a chapter do that.
Hmm.
Obviously, you need to have context. But in terms of dividing up a narrative, I think he's right that you don't want to. The whole idea of a chapter format, I started thinking about a lot. I started reading novels and thinking about the way that what is the purpose of a chapter? Why do they exist? And it's to make it kind of a legible unit of thought, kind of like a larger version of a paragraph. It's also to cover a legible moment in time, or it's to cover an argument. And you can try to do both or all those things. But the thing that's probably least effective for a chapter is just like basically like the info dump. Like, here's everything in my notes about this time or this place. Here's all the stuff that I found. That does happen sometimes in books, and I've done that before, um, like to a certain extent. But it doesn't really move a narrative forward or make it interesting for a reader just to like plop down everything you found in your research process in one spot.
Agreed. When you were outlining this book or the chapters, were you listing chapters and dates and sort of main events or drama you wanted to cover?
Yeah. And I was actually thinking in terms of chapter titles a lot because I always get kind of energized by a good chapter title. So like, there's a chapter title called like Siamese Fighting Fish, that is about this guy who ended up becoming friends with Bates and Ann Mead, who was like the one of the leading psychedelic researchers in the 50s, and he was also like the main point of connection between the psychedelic research world and the CIA, Harold Abramson. And he was like obsessed, truly obsessed with giving LSD to Siamese fighting fish. So I just like had this mental image of a chapter that kind of begins or ends with his tank of fish. And so that kind of like helped me figure out the beats of the narrative. Like I just knew that I wanted these floaty little fish in a laboratory in 1953 to be like showing up fairly prominently. Partly because I later have a chapter about dolphin research in the 60s and dolphins were given LSD. So I wanted like a little bit of some kind of point of connection or foreshadowing of that earlier on. Um, and I also just really enjoyed thinking about like what is the most dramatic moment or to me, the most historically interesting part of each unit that I divided up. So I would try to kind of find a scene or a problem or an argument, like an historical argument that I could make that would be like the thing that would get me interested to write it. So I have one, I think I still have a chapter called The Psychedelic Cold War, which was a term that I actually thought about calling the book. And that's like an argument-driven chapter about how the Cold War, at least from the early 50s, really was kind of shaped by this concern over like altered states of consciousness as both a tool for positive transformation, but also as a weapon in the Cold War. Like the idea of brainwashing is very much entangled with early psychedelic research. It's the same people, literally the same people, coining and developing the term brainwashing, and then doing many of the key early psychedelic studies. Um, Rebecca Limov at Harvard is I think just finishing now a book about brainwashing that gets into that, and it's like that kind of those kind of themes. Like I really liked thinking about chapters in terms of like what is the big theme of the chapter? How can I make a title that encapsulates that theme and gets me interested in, moving forward in the writing process? Because, I wrote the book during COVID and there were definitely moments when I was not motivated to finish it.
Yeah, I mean, and as a reader too, I'm often standing in the bookstore looking at the table of contents, and it's great to be intrigued by chapter titles. One of the things we've gotten to speak to some of our guests about who are academics and who have done trade press books is how they found their agent. This is something that many academics don't know much about, and we've heard there are many paths to someone finding an agent. I wonder if you could tell us how this happened for you.
Honestly, it was sort of, I don't feel like it's that representative of a story, and I feel like I got very lucky with it. So I kind of feel bad saying it. Basically, I just wrote an article when I was in grad school for The Atlantic, theatlantic.com, like the website, version of The Atlantic Monthly. And it was about the history of drugs. It related to my dissertation research and kind of related to this current book. And I think it did fairly well in terms of getting picked up online, and I just had like two or three different agents reach out to me as a result of that. I don't really know why, and I think that the circumstances have changed since then. In the literary world, this was like an era when things would go viral on Twitter easily, I think. I'm talking like 2011, 12.
Right.
And I think that's kind of maybe what happened. So I had my pick between two or three different people, and I just kind of picked the one um, whose agency represented people I had heard of. I remember Patti Smith was represented by them. So I was like, that sounds good to me. Um, and I was very naive, and actually, Yishai, he's not actually a literary agent anymore. I've moved on to a different agent. He left the business, but he was very, very helpful in terms of helping me like not be stressed about it. For my first book, I was just like, it's an academic book. I don't really see the point of having an agent for this book because there's no advances in academic books at all, really. And so he was like, that's fine. So he like just kept me on his list for 10 years or like
Wow.
8 or 9 years without me doing anything. And then we sort of started talking about this idea for a book in 2017, 18. So I guess it was like 7 years. I just didn't really have anything to offer him. And he was very helpful and supportive. And I was very lucky with that. I think it's much harder. I get the impression that it's harder now. I don't really know what's changed. It just seems more competitive, and um, I don't really know how you'd go about getting an agent now, unfortunately. It's funny how different 2011 or 2012 feels to me now compared to the present.
Yeah, it is. So it sounds like you end up switching agents then?
Yeah, when Yashai left the business, I just actually asked my editor if he could recommend someone he knew, because that's the thing is agents and editors are so like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And in fact, some cases, it turns out I didn't realize this, but it seems like sometimes they switch. Like sometimes an agent will become an editor.
Hmm.
Uh, so they clearly know. It seemed he felt like he was the best person to make a suggestion to me because he knew them all and he knew my writing. So yeah, he recommended Lucy Cleland, um, and so she's my agent now. Yeah.
And I guess what agents do for academic authors, or just authors in general, really varies. Is your agent someone who's reading work and giving you real feedback on the writing or the content?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it is for everyone, but that's my experience personally is in both cases, it's quite, yeah, it's like a writing workshop sort of feeling, which I like. I really need that. I've heard of other agents where you just send them a finished book and then they just shop it around, but that doesn't seem appealing to me. I really like getting feedback on writing. I like being edited. I like having discussions before even the writing process. So definitely hands-on is what I prefer. I've heard that there's both, but um, I think, especially if you're an academic, it really helps to have an agent who's willing to kind of get in there with you and actually edit the proposal and even help think through the book because it is a different world to write for a popular audience or to try to write a crossover book that is going to reach academics and a mass audience, which is what I was trying to do. And we don't really have much training in knowing how to do that, in my experience.
Yeah.
Whereas agents, that's their bread and butter is knowing how to work with. A lot of them specialize in working with academics, it seems. So that's definitely extremely helpful.
How would you explain how you understood what to do to write that kind of book? Was it because of what you were reading and so absorbing this kind of narrative, or um, did you have a mentor who was doing this kind of writing also?
I really liked Plutopia. It's weird how much Plutopia shaped me. I loved that book, and also actually I mentioned Rebecca Limov. Her first book is was also a trade book. So she was really interesting sort of guide into understanding like how to write a book like that kind of threads the needle. It's called The Data, or sorry, what it wasn't her first book actually. The World is Laboratory. It is her first book. Yeah, The World is Laboratory 2005. That's a really great book that was a model for me. And then Charles King, he's a professor at Georgetown, I believe, and Gods of the Upper Air came out while I was researching this book, and I really loved how that book was written. I think it's beautifully written, just like
Hmm.
an exceptionally good book, um, in terms of prose style, but also making an argument. So that was the other big one for me. And then also just a shout out to my mother. She passed away while I was writing the book. Um, she knew I was working on it and like read early. She read my book proposal for it. She was sort of like I would say definitely the biggest influence on me as a writer. She was a poet, and didn't really get a chance to pursue writing as a profession because she grew up poor and had my half sister when she was 19 years old, and then had two other kids and didn't really have that outlet to kind of you know she wasn't lucky enough to be a
Yeah.
professor or have like a job that is amenable to publishing books, but she
Hmm.
was such a good writer, and she always edited me and helped me with that. So actually, that was the biggest influence was my mom.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. In terms of other folks you might have showed your writing to, it's something that I guess a lot of us professors figure out that we have to create for ourselves these writing groups or finding the colleagues and friends who are willing to do this. When you were working on these two books, did you have the same group of friends or colleagues who read for you, or did it change over time?
No, it kind of changed. I feel like switching to the 20th century opened me up to a different group of people that I could be in dialogue with, which was actually really fun. But no, I mean, I did keep the same general topic. I'm still an historian of medicine and science, so that's sort of like in the same ballpark. And I had some of the same readers. Yeah, it definitely had a few of the same readers, so I'm very grateful too. But it was also very fun because it was COVID when I was doing the bulk of the research and writing of the book. I was able to set up Zoom calls and email with people who otherwise I actually would have been quite busy. It was sort of like a weird one part of it that was easier. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, I just mentioned that my mother passed away, and I had my wife and I had our first child during writing this book. So those two things were like quite intense
Yeah.
and distracting, obviously. But being able to like just call up people or talk to them in depth about a topic just because they were home like I was, like let's say it was like summer 2020, that was so helpful. And so I think a lot of them in the book, I mean, hopefully all of them in the acknowledgments, but like, um, yeah, specifically like Peter Mandler it wrote a really good book called Return from the Natives, which is like about Margaret Mead and the Cold War. He was extremely helpful, and there were several other people like that who just kind of shared their expertise with me. We traded notes about archival things we had found, and that was like I truly couldn't have done it without that help because I was sort of learning a new time period, and also just trying to engage with Margaret Mead's archive. Like it's huge. It's crazy how big her archive is. So getting help from them, and also I had a couple of research assistants who like followed up on things for me when I wasn't physically at the Library of Congress, and that was very helpful too.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to do an episode with another academic who did a spiritual biography of Margaret Mead and mentioned this huge Library of Congress collection. How did you handle that, organizing the research you were doing from it and just figuring out how to move through it in an efficient way?
I didn't figure out a way to move it in an efficient way. There is no way
Mm-hmm.
to do that. I don't think it's it's uh it's really an amazing archive. I've never really seen anything like it actually. I'm not aware of any individual archive that is of that scale. I'm sure there might be a couple, but there can't be that many.
Mm-hmm.
Because Mead was sort of like an industry. Like she had like a team of people over a period of decades archiving everything that came into her office. And also she co-wrote a lot with other people. And she had like sort of like she was sort of like James Patterson. Like how James Patterson writes like 10 books a year because he has like it's like James Patterson is like an entity of like several different people who kind of all
Mm-hmm.
collaborate. In some sense, that's kind of what she was. Her life partner after Ruth Benedict and Bateson, Rhoda Matro, was sort of like an amanuensis. Am I saying that right? Sort of like a
Right.
both an amanuensis, like someone who wrote down what she was saying, but also a close collaborator and someone who almost kind of embodied her voice as a writer. So Rhoda Matro's archive is also there, and they're kind of entangled with each other. And then, weirdly enough, Bateson, I think, when they got divorced in and or separated in 1948, divorced in 1950, it would appear that Bateson left behind most of his archive with Margaret Mead at her office in the American Museum of Natural History, because
Mm-hmm.
most of Bateson's archive from the 40s is actually in Mead's archive, not here in UC Santa Cruz, where we nominally possess the Gregory Bateson papers. So it's a really complex archive because it's really not just one person's archive. It's like a social world of people who left their stuff with Margaret Mead. And in some cases, she's like annotating things from the 30s, but writing it in the 50s. And then there's like a little note attached to it after she died by Rhoda Matro, annotating that.
Mm.
And so it's like it's very multi-layered.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with archives from the 16th century, which are like that, but it's weird to see one from like the 20th century, which is so complicated in that way. So I didn't really find any method. I just kind of wove through the finding aid, which was really helpful. Um, and stumbled, I think just because it was listed in the finding aid, on her LSD memo, which was like the moment when I realized the book would center on Margaret Mead, because suddenly there's this one document from 1954 where she is listing all these names of other people in the book that she's talking about LSD with. You know, Aldous Huxley, Harold Abramson, all these people that I had been researching as figures that were important. This document kind of linked them together directly in a way I hadn't noticed before in the archives, and it was secret. I mean, it wasn't like the document itself was secret, but she was going to take LSD. The document describes her intention to take LSD in a public way. And then if you read the letters around it that were sent at the same time she was writing it, you can see her deciding not to and pulling back. And then if you cross-reference that with her FBI file, you can see the FBI is investigating her in that exact month. They
Mm.
begin their investigation, and it's quite intense because it's like J. Edgar Hoover is personally overseeing it, and like the file has J. Edgar Hoover kind of castigating the lower ranking FBI people, saying,
Mm.
hurry up with the investigation. They're interviewing her neighbors. They're asking about her political ties. Is she a communist? They don't get into the realm of her sexuality, but they clearly could have, because for instance, they're asking about what happened with Gregory Bateson, why is she no longer married to him, who is she, kind of asking around about her love life. And in that moment, she and Rhoda Matro, who I mentioned, were about to move in together. So clearly, I think circumstantially, it's pretty clear that those things are related,
Yeah.
and so that memo let me. It was just like this moment where I was like, okay, this is a central part of the book now. It connects together these different threads in a personal story about Margaret Mead that has not been told before, and that's very illuminating, not just about her life, but about the Cold War, about psychedelic science, about science in general in the 50s. It's like an kind of a companion story to the Oppenheimer movie and book, which was actually a big influence on me. I love that book, the book that the Oppenheimer movie is based on,
Mm.
American Prometheus, because it takes a single person's life and uses it to like make a emblematic case of what went wrong and what happened in the 20th century in science and in the world in this way that I found very beautiful. It was like sympathetic to him, but he was also obviously a tragic figure. And so, like, finding that little part of Mead's archive out of all the other stuff was so clarifying for me, because it was like the spiritual core of my book was that one little folder called the LSD memo that was like 4 pages long.
So I hadn't realized, but it sounds like originally you thought this book is kind of about this group of people, and Mead's centrality became apparent during because of the research.
Yes, yes. Originally, I wasn't going to write a book about Margaret Mead. It was going to be about the book could have been called the Macy Circle. It's not a very good name, but there's these group conferences of these different scientists, usually today associated with cybernetics, like this kind of obsolete field that sort of you could argue was the predecessor to computer science and AI research. A lot of the same, like Claude Shannon, for instance, was involved in this. He's like a founder of modern computing. Um, it's usually thought of in that realm. But the Macy Foundation was actually a medical. research foundation. They were funding medical research primarily, and they still exist doing that. And they funded the first international conference on LSD and psychotherapy. And even before that, they had these conferences that Margaret Mead actually helped organize called Problems of Consciousness, which were about that science of consciousness I was talking about earlier. And it's, I think, one of the earliest references to LSD in a scientific conference of any kind is in one of those early mid 50s conferences at the Macy Foundation. So originally that was my way into the topic. I just wanted to excavate what was going on with these people, this group of people. And I was thinking about it as like a group history of these conferences in that world. And it had lots of the same elements because they were getting CIA funding. So that part was the Cold War part was there. And they had a lot of interesting personal lives of people involved. And Mead and Bateson were involved. They were attending them. But it wasn't until I found that memo where I was like, oh, Margaret Mead is like much more central in this than I thought. And then in Timothy Leary's archive, I found a letter that Timothy Leary wrote to Margaret Mead saying, will you do psilocybin mushrooms with me? He was trying to enlist her in his own project at Harvard. So that was really interesting to realize that there was like a through line connecting the psychedelic history that I already knew, that partially I got from like Michael Pollan's book and other books like that, and then that the world of Mead and anthropology, which I didn't know about.
Yeah. So what has it been like having this trade press book that's gotten so much attention out in the world? How has it differed from when book one came out?
It's so hard to answer because um, both were shaped by COVID. Like book one came out into the like I think technically December 2019, but it didn't actually enter the world until like January, February 2020. So it's like kind of like I'm like a worrier about global pandemics in general. Like I teach history of medicine classes, so I from January 2020, I was like really hung up on COVID, reading about it and stuff. So honestly, my first book kind of got shaped by that. And then second book was earlier this year is when it was released, so it was different. But I our first daughter was born January 2022, and then my wife and I now have a second daughter born February 2024. So in both cases, like the book launch was swiftly replaced by something more important. And so it's kind of just been like in my own memory, like completely overlapped with those things. But no, it was so fun to talk to Terry Gross. I love Terry Gross.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan since I was a teenager
Hmm.
of Fresh Air and like her interview style. And I actually used some of her interviews for the book, like
Oh,
her interviews
really?
with Allen Ginsberg and Timothy Leary.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was so fun to talk to her. I was like very thrilled by that. She was exactly what I pictured. So that was it's always nice when people are like you
Actually,
think they're going to be.
yeah. Great. Well, there's two questions we ask all of our guests, and one of them is if there's something that you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career.
I guess I would say, well, this is a small thing, but in grad school, I got really hung up on like finding some new software that would help me write better, or like some kind of note-taking method or a writing method. Um, using Zotero for annotation for references, and then using Scrivener, is it called?
Right.
And then Devon Think Pro and all these different note-taking tools,
Hmm.
and getting really hung up on the method of writing and researching, like the actual like apparatus
Hmm.
of it, and not actually just doing it. And I've just come full circle now to just like writing everything in a giant Word file and not caring about it,
Hmm.
because it's just about getting down. If you're doing archival research, it's just about getting the stuff from the archive on a page. It doesn't matter what page. And then if you're writing, I'm really a believer in like the John Steinbeck. I was reading John Steinbeck's writing advice, and he just said, don't edit as you go. Just like get it on a page and then come back to it. If you're trying to make it perfect with each line, you're going to lose the forward momentum, and it's just going to end up sounding kind of weird. The more I try, I'm not good at following that advice, but the more I try to kind of make it perfect, the harder it gets. And in the moments where I actually wrote part of this book literally while having a newborn sleeping on me on my phone.
Hmm.
And like those are some of my favorite parts that I wrote, because I was just having to like touch type on a phone into Microsoft Word for iOS, which I actually recommend. It's like a helpful tool.
Hmm.
uh, and not it, when it's like a tiny little screen, you can't even see the context. You just have to get it down. And that was kind of liberating. And I wish I had just been a little bit more laid back and less hung up on the doing it the right way when I
Hmm.
was starting out.
Yeah, no, I feel that too. Sometimes things seem to come at me sort of sideways, or at times when I'm not expecting it, and if I can just like go with it and get it down, that can be really productive. Another question we ask is if there's a writing practice or habit, something that you're doing that's working for you now.
Going running. I
Mm.
started running during the pandemic, and I get so many ideas from running. I'm not the only person who said that. I had heard people saying that so many times before I started running or walking, but it's so true that it gives you ideas. It's kind of nuts how much it stimulates the writing part of my brain. Like I just start getting ideas, and if I don't do it, I could just be staring at a screen all day and not get anything done. I find it very effective. Just physical movement of any kind. I didn't know that until a couple of years ago, and I'm 39 now, so I wish I had known that earlier. But yeah, that's pretty much been the main thing that's been helpful for me
Great.
recently.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thank you so much, Ben. This has been really interesting and a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's fun to talk about methods with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.